The first Red Scare. As you might guess, there's also a second Red Scare, but we won't get to that quite yet. It was quite scary, as these ominous steps are indicating. And the steps kind of give us a good overview of what's going to happen. The man walking is labor, so workers. And there's going to be a lot of issues when it comes to labor. And people are calling it the Red Scare because, well, they attribute a lot of it to communism. So what's going on? A lot of the roots come during the First World War, the Great War. And a lot of the big labor unions, including the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, as well as the Socialist Party, they are very opposed to joining the war in Europe. And since the United States government decides to join the war, it then becomes the government's task to speak out against these people and say, well, they're being un-American, they aren't supporting us, so it becomes very much a slander smear campaign. You need Eugene Debs. He's the head of the Socialist Party. He runs for president, gets 900,000 votes. He gets thrown in jail for inciting people, especially not to go into the draft. So there is a draft in the United States during the war, and he says, well, we shouldn't go to war at all. Don't join the army. So he is thrown into jail, whereas he's also trying to run for president from jail because of what he is saying. And he is thrown in jail in part because of the laws that are passed. Namely, we have the Sedition bills. That's going against, as we've talked about before, this idea of free speech and free press, and as this cartoon says, honest opinion. So these poor little children are going to be eaten by this giant snake that is preventing them from saying what they want to say. Of course, I'm not quite sure what children are going to be saying, but it's a good image nonetheless. So you have government in the United States that's very critical of any dissenting opinions. And in many cases, they have legitimate concerns. Namely, during the Russian Revolution, there's a lot of violence that's going on in Russia. And it's called the Red Terror. They are enjoying this use of the word red and something afterwards. So the Red Terror in Russia, during the Russian Revolution, opponents to the communist revolutionaries are tracked down and assassinated. Estimates range between 10 to 15,000 and upwards of 1 million people were killed in Russia. Here's a scene here in Russia where soldiers had opened up a fire on people on the street. As you can see, there's a lot of people down on the street. So the United States is scared. So that's kind of how they are justifying it. They're saying these communists, they are violent people, and we need to protect our country. So in the United States, how this manifests itself, namely the U.S. is going after people that are in unions. They see unions as these groups that have a lot of socialist leanings because they see them as fighting for workers, that workers need a share of the wealth that these very rich people are getting. And having that belief that, you should make good money, at that time is often considered to be a socialist or communist idea. Workers shouldn't be making all this money, the owners of the companies are. So you have a number of walkouts and strikes in the United States. People gather, and you sometimes have violence when there's so many people that really are trying to fight for their rights. Coupled with that, there's a great deal of civil rights issues. There's race riots that are going on. where African Americans are being accused of being communists or socialist sympathizers or socialists as a whole. You still have a whole lot of segregation, but we're going to be getting a bit more into this next week. Actually, no, tomorrow. So, you have a lot of anger in this sense, too. We also have a quite important historic event in Boston. It's called the Boston Police Strikes. So, in 1919, the Boston Police, the average salary was $1,400, and which was a pretty good salary before the war. After the war, inflation goes up, so goods start costing a lot more money, and the salary that the Boston Police are making isn't quite as good as it used to be. So they say, hey, we need a raise in our salary, and the police commissioner says no. So they say, all right, if you don't want to give us a raise, we're going to go on strike, which is unheard of. You don't have police going on strike. Who's going to control the city? It's going to be mayhem. And sure enough, the police, they walk out, and there's some problems going on in Boston. Certainly when it happens, they call in the National Guard, or the State Guard at the time. They make the Parks Service become police officers. But, so these police officers, they walked out saying it's alright. Of course, at this time, people are very afraid of these socialists and communists, so the police are all fired. Every single one of them loses their job, and they hire back new police officers who have higher wages and better conditions than the ones that have been fired. And other than that, there hasn't really been a police strike until the 70s when some people in Baltimore went on strike, but it's a very rare occurrence. As you can understand, people are frightened if there was no police, so often they give into any demands that are demanded. So most of this Red Scare is manifested in labor disputes. There's, in 1919, there's also a massive steel strike. It shut down almost half of the steel industry, and that's coupled with a massive coal strike. And in response to all these strikes, there's also, as we noted, a great deal of racial tension. The U.S. government starts cracking down, and they crack down with what's known as the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids are carried out by the Attorney General of the United States, whose name is A. Mitchell Palmer, thus the name. And he is finding a way to reduce the violence and tension that's going on in the country. And he sees that the best way is to arrest a lot of people and ship them out of the country. So you have approximately 10,000 people are arrested. And certainly most of them are not deported, but there's about 500 people that are eventually found to be socialists or communists, and there's some of them seen here sitting in Ellis Island, and they're shipped out in the Soviet Ark. So they get deported from the country for having a certain political belief that the government sees as violent and against the beliefs of the country. So most of this kind of brings, the Palmer Raids especially, brings an end to a lot of the tension, violence that's going on. It certainly continues. You even have members of the New York State Legislature that get expelled from their positions as politicians. So this really sweeps across the country. So this is the first Red Scare, and eventually things settle down, but it will have dramatic repercussions later on when we get to the second one.